British Museum and the collections of scientific instruments. That does not include the clocks. But what it includes are all the instruments which use other ways of measuring time. Now, when I explain those to people, there are instruments which work with the sun, instruments which work with the moon, instruments which predict tides, people always look at me slightly pityingly and say, yeah, but you know, they're not precise. So, what do these instruments actually do? They trace what is around us. So they link us directly to the sun, the moon, the stars, or the tides. And when the instruments tell us exactly what's out there, we can't say it's not precise because that is what nature tells us. Well, clocks do also from that. Now, there are other ways of telling time, and we have those objects in the museum.
Counterpoint to that and to what Silke has said is to draw your attention to the fact that time itself is a concept that we regard as perfectly normal and natural to think about. I'm saying I'm making an assumption here that we're all, you know, from Western type societies. Maybe we're not all, and that would be kind of interesting if we're not. But I'm making that assumption. That it seems to us a natural concept. We think habitually in terms of time. It's not just that we look at our watches, we look at what time the trains are going to be leaving and so on. It's that for us, time is something that we focus upon. Time is kind of goes without saying in most cultures, and I guess for most periods in the past. So there's something rather peculiar with a kind of an obsession with time, which is kind of slightly independent from the particular issues about whether it's fast or slow, or whether we'd like to speed it up or slow it down. I don't know many people want to speed it up. Most people want to slow it down a bit.
For musicians, our entire world is time, so really to be sitting specifically talking about it is a little odd. Everything we do is about organising time. In fact, it's difficult to find anything within the practice, and I use the word carefully, the practice of music which is not about time. And I think I would like to illustrate this with a story and a very short piece of music. In 1790, Marie Antoinette's musicien de chambre, who was Giovanni Battista Viotti, was walking in the French Alps. And he published this story in a little pamphlet which I found in the British Library with the piece of music which goes with it. And he's described walking in a valley and finding himself in a place he didn't recognise. And he falls into an almost kind of proto-romantic rapture about the perfect tableau that was established and beautiful verdant streams, etc., etc. And suddenly he heard music. And he's so struck by the music that as he said, he sat down involuntarily on a rock and started listening. And after he'd run over to find what it was. And he found himself looking at what he describes as, quote, a kind of wooden trumpet, long wooden trumpet, which of course is an alphorn, with a woman singing in unison with it. Now, he was faced with a problem, which was, as a musician, his instinct was to listen and to be suffused with this experience. But as well, like me, a bit of a nerd, his initial response was he needed to find a way that he could remember it. So he actually talked about pulling himself out of his reverie and committing it to memory. And as soon as he got back to his, wherever he was staying, he doesn't say what that was, he tried to write it down. And he said that he realised that he had to write it down, and I have to use French here, sans mesure, literally without bar lines, without the division of time. And he said, because he realised that in order to write it down with the bar lines, with the division into 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, which are the tactus, which is, if you like, has been the driving force of most Western music for the past, at least the last 400 years anyway. He said in order to use those, he would render this piece, and he used the word very carefully, denatured. And of course, this is the beginning of the notion of the word, which several of us have used this evening already, natural, which in itself is a construct, which emerges at that time. And he then said that in order for this to be experienced, he had to present it in some way where there had to be a suspension of disbelief so that his audience could find their way in their imagination back to the place and time that he heard it. So he would only ever play it to the best of his friends and the most sympathetic of audiences. So this is actually the first documentation we have of a Western musician choosing to chuck away the fundamental notion of division in order to articulate time. In fact, saying, I can't use clock time. Just at the moment that people such as Maisel were coming up with a clockwork metronome. So I'll just play this. It's a couple of minutes. I'm not going to put the violin anywhere near that thing, that's why. By the way, it's a Ranstavash, which is basically a cow calling tune. So if you like, that's my tiny little articulation of, if you like, actually a massive kick in the teeth for the Western notion of musical time. And that had a huge impact in its day. If you listen to the Scène Chant from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, it begins with that, he'd heard it. And his two Charlemagne calling to each other are taken from Viotti's little countune. So that's my little present now.
There's some truth that we're more disconnected than some other cultures still existing on this planet.
Well, I think the moon example is obviously connected with the other major factor, which we should never really lose sight of, which is the human life cycle. Obviously, the moon is related to mensuration and menstruation, actually both. And in that sense, I think that we are obviously, it's very hard to not speak in a way that's kind of cliche-ridden, but we're obviously part of nature, but at the same time, nature is a construct for us in the way that Peter was explaining. It is a matter of choosing what medium to manipulate in order to create chronology for life. But when I say for life, what I mean is for something which is rather distinctive of the human species, and which we sometimes lose sight of as we're struggling to cope with problems with time as individuals or as small groups. That is to say that the calibration of time is a social activity. And I don't mean simply that for an individual to decide that this might be a good idea needs the sort of endorsement of others in society, but it is the, if you like, the collective assemblage of ideas towards a certain consensus that over a period of time leads to what we think of as associated with a particular culture or a particular period.